Myles Garrett has been suspended. It's just come down from the NFL indefinitely for the rest of the season, for the postseason. Myles Garrett for his hit on Mason Rudolph. And so that's the very latest. We're going to be talking about this throughout the day. This is the story of the day, probably through the weekend. But the NFL did the right thing and made the move right now. Forget about the money. Forget about all that other stuff. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Myles Garrett is suspended indefinitely without pay. And he's going to have to go through the process with the commissioner and all that stuff. But that is through the season, including the postseason and into next year. We don't know yet, but that's the situation. We're going to be talking to a bunch of people here on Sports by Brooks on FanCred. This really is the place for you to be right now. I'm so glad you're here. So glad we're on your phone. We're streaming. We're on your tablet. And we're going to be doing this throughout the next couple of hours, talking about this with some of the biggest names in football media, NFL media, sports media across the swath of the industry. And I can't think of a better person to lead things off in relation to this and maybe some other things involving the NFL with a big weekend coming up. Greg Bedard of the Boston Sports Journal and the Las Vegas Review-Journal, does national, does New England, does it all. And Greg, what an unbelievable series of events that we had at the end of that game last night. What was your response when you first saw it, your first blush reaction to it?
My first reaction, Brooks, I guess, I mean, obviously you're a little bit appalled, but, anytime somebody's swinging a helmet, and luckily it was the open end and not the other end. But any time somebody's doing that, I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous. There's no place in the game. He's obviously going to be suspended for a while. But, then again, and I just filed this for the Las Vegas Review-Journal as some of my thoughts about this is, I knew the overreaction was going to come. I mean, it's, should he be arrested on assault charges? What about the children? Like all that stuff. I mean, I mean, come on. This is football. It is controlled violence. You have guys who are paid millions of dollars to assault each other on every single play, stuff that would get them arrested in everyday life. And, occasionally one of them is going to cross the line. It happens. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often. And so I don't think it should go further than that. I mean, he'll be suspended 4 games to possibly the rest of the season. I assume Goodell will overreact to this being Thursday Night Football on NFL Network. You have Steve Smith going on right after the game and saying about, how his season should be over. And, Goodell is going to overreact to that. It'll probably be reduced from there, probably to 4 or 5 games. And he'll pay a substantial price, and I think it should just end there. Any other talk beyond that, I think is just ludicrous and over the top.
By the way, thanks for joining us, man. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Greg Bedard is with us from the Las Vegas Review-Journal and the Boston Sports Journal. Now, hear me out though, because I agree essentially with everything you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But, and you, I think, made the central point, at least for me. It's amazing that something like this hasn't happened more often.
Yeah.
Because this is a sport that toes this line of barbarity. It goes right up to that line. And in my lifetime, football has really moved to the center, I think, of our culture, much more so.
Yeah.
And for that reason, Greg, I really think this is something where you can't come down hard enough on Garrett because of just the fact that it's so unprecedented that you really need to kind of make a statement to draw that a really bright line here. I mean, what do you think of that?
I mean, idea? I can understand that thinking.
I mean, I know it's football. Yeah.
I mean, I can understand that thinking, but I think, if you put, well, that's not true because, if you've been on Twitter long enough, it's Idiotville out there. But
right.
If you polled the general public, I mean, 99% of them, including football players, would have said that was wrong. That can't, everyone knows that's wrong. And I don't think he needs to be made an example of. I don't think it needs to be over the top. I think 4 or 5 games. I mean, look, Andre Hainsworth got 5 games for stomping all over Andre Gerard's face in 2006, and the guy needed like 30 stitches. And Hainsworth, we're talking about like one of the dregs of the NFL who had a history and things like that. That you knew this was just basically a matter of time before this happened with him. And, you're going to Myles Garrett. Yeah, he's been suspended twice this season, but he doesn't have a history of this. He's a smart kid. He lost his mind in the moment. And I just don't think that needs to be made an example of just to satisfy Park Avenue and places like that.
And as we've been speaking, Greg, the punishment, at least the initial phase of it, has come down. We understand now from the NFL that Garrett has been suspended without pay indefinitely. I'm reading this. Garrett has been suspended without pay indefinitely at a minimum for the remainder of the regular season and postseason, and must meet with the commissioner's office prior to a decision on his reinstatement. So this is kind of a long decision involving other guys. But so essentially Garrett's gone for this season and the postseason without pay indefinitely, must meet with the commissioner's office prior to a decision on his reinstatement. I'll read the rest of his paragraph. He was also fined an additional amount. Garrett violated unnecessary roughness and unsportsmanlike conduct rules, as well as fighting, removing the helmet of an opponent, and using the helmet as a weapon. So your response?
I mean, it's typical. I mean, it's what I thought. It would be over the top. It's Goodell. It was Thursday Night Football. It was, all of those things. And so he's typically going to react over the top. And, the NFLPA will have its say. I mean, they're in an interesting spot because it's player-on-player violence. But they need to do their best for each side. I mean, I think it's a bit unprecedented for them to say indefinitely banning him. I mean, I would assume that it would be cut, but who knows? I mean, this is typical of Goodell. There's no precedent. He goes how the wind blows, and obviously after last night being in prime time on NFL Network and Fox and Amazon and all these other places, he's going to overreact. So this is typical of his tenure.
Do you think we're visiting with Greg Bedard of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Boston Sports Journal? Do you think that this? So as I just read to you, the paragraph as it pertains to Garrett is Garrett has been suspended without pay indefinitely at a minimum for the remainder of the regular season and postseason. Is that completely unprecedented? That's never happened.
I don't think it has. I think it is unprecedented. Yeah.
Now, when you talk about him, going off and freelancing and doing what he's doing, the commissioner, and of course, this is not the first time he's done this. Do you think what specifically do you think is prompting that? Do you think it's the fact that this is on CNN this morning, or it's crossed over to Maine? Is that really what's driving this, or is it just a particular owner, perhaps they just got off the phone with, or what do you think is in the mind, or it's just his own mind and his own sensibility?
I think, the act was deplorable. I mean, using a helmet and swinging it at another player, is bad. I mean, I don't really see what the difference is between that and kicking a guy in his face with long cleats. Like, I don't see what the difference is and why the suspension should be any different for Garrett than it was for Hainsworth. But, it's all those things. It's, it's on CNN. Everyone's talking about it. It was on its own network. Goodell certainly goes how the wind blows, and that, people like Steve Smith and Peter King are out there, screaming about, he should be suspended for the rest of the season. It impacts Goodell. It does.
Do you think the fact that it happened, high profile game, and it's the quarterback position, and perhaps the back of people's minds that know what's going on, the Earl Thomas incident, with him being knocked out, Rudolph, but namely that this is a quarterback, and it's the nature of how this thing played out. Is that a part of it? Had this happened on the offensive line and defensive line, do you think we'd be talking about it in this way, and we'd have this sort of punishment?
I think we would. I mean, I think it's just the visual of one player without his helmet being smashed with his own helmet is pretty damning, and it's hard to get past. I mean, look, here's another example. Antonio Smith a few years ago in the preseason took Richie Incognito's helmet and swung it at him, and didn't make contact or, egregious contact, certainly not in the head, more of in the midsection. And he was suspended for 2 preseason games and a regular season game. I mean, that he hit Rudolph on the head, does it make it that much worse? I mean, so what? The guy has good aim. I mean, I think they're all the same. If you're going to use the helmet as a weapon, whether you make contact or not, those penalties should all be the same.
So essentially what we're looking at here is we've got a game that's so violent, that is so approaching barbarity to a certain extent, right? Gladiatorial in nature, that the whole point is, guys, to say that this is so much worse, to get the vapors, it's so much worse, is to be ignoring the reality of what you're watching and supporting. Is that kind of the point to this, you think?
I mean, look earlier in the game. I mean, Demarius Randall was ejected earlier in the game for a helmet-to-helmet hit where he was a heat-seeking missile. I mean, what's
bleeding out of his ear, the receiver.
Yeah. I mean, that guy was completely knocked out. He was all messed up from the hit, and that's a 230-pound athlete getting a running start using his head. What's worse, that or swinging a helmet at another guy? I mean, it's all degrees of certain things, and it's certainly the swinging of the helmet is bad. But I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I'm a simpleton, but I can't discern between that and Vontaze Burfict launching at guys in the middle of the field. And yes,
I'm with you
for this year, but up until now, all he got was multi-game suspensions. Yeah. And so, what's the difference? It's the helmet being used as a weapon. I don't understand the different degrees of it.
I 100% agree with you on that, Greg. So we're visiting with Greg Bedard of Las Vegas Review-Journal, Boston Sports Journal. Let's get to the game, and I want to talk a couple of things about you, with you, about some of the things you've been working on, you've been writing about, but specifically about the Browns and the Steelers and Mason Rudolph as a quarterback. My assessment is, I don't think this guy is the quarterback of the future. Maybe I'm jumping off the deep end on it, but what's your assessment of Rudolph at this point? Have we got enough of a sample size on this guy?
No, but I mean, and he has had his moments. I thought he came into the game playing well. I thought last night, I mean, obviously losing Juju Smith-Schuster to a concussion is not going to help, and the other receiver as well. But I thought Aikman made a lot of valid points that sort of show up on film last night about how he's kind of heavy-legged and he doesn't move well within the.
He's stiff.
Yeah, he is, and he doesn't sense pressure that well. He can't evade it that well, and that's it's kind of essential. I mean, anybody can play quarterback from a clean pocket. What you do when things break down and in the crucial moments later in the game are sort of what define you as a quarterback, and I think he's going to have a tough time measuring up. I mean, could I see him in a competition with somebody, whether it's a draft pick or another free agent or something like that? Depending on what Roethlisberger does in the offseason, sure. But certainly we haven't seen anything yet that would make the Steelers think that this guy's the quarterback of the future.
A lot of people have been lauding the resurgence, so to speak, of the Steelers. Are you convinced that this is something that's going to last, or is it a mirage?
No, I think it's a mirage. I mean, you look at, everybody's celebrating, Mike Tomlin for being a coach of the year and what he's done. I mean, look who they beat coming in. It was the Chargers. It was the Dolphins. It was the Colts when Brissett got knocked out of the game. And then the Rams are just kind of a mess right now. So that wasn't all that surprising. And then last night, I mean, the Steelers can't even get the right people on the field, and then they have a humongous coverage bust where 2 guys are wide open in the end zone on one of the Browns' touchdowns. I mean, I just think it was they were lucky who they played at a certain point in time. They made a few more plays than the other team, but other than that, no, I'm not. I said last week I wasn't buying on the Steelers, and I'm certainly not buying on them now.
And I think the takeaway statistics are a major factor right now, and that's just a little blip, and there's never any correlation year to year between those takeaways. So when it comes to the Browns, one specific question that I want to move on from this game, Odell Beckham and Baker Mayfield, I mean, just what are your thoughts there, the disconnect there?
Well, I mean, I think the big thing is you're talking about 2 inherently selfish players. And I actually think that, you saw some of that on display last night with Baker's reaction to the Garrett incident in the post game with NFL Network. I mean, for him to go on there, I mean, I know he's being lauded nationally as, oh, that's leadership. Yeah, I mean, that's leadership to the outside world. I don't know if that's going to be viewed as leadership in that locker room. And I think a lot of guys will see him, there's two things you don't talk about as an NFL player. You don't talk about another person's family, and you don't talk about another player's wallet. And for him saying like he's going to be suspended in that, that obviously does not help Garrett's case. I think some corners of that locker room will look at that incident as sort of like, here's another example of Baker sort of playing to the outside world, goes along with his commercials and other things like that, and he's not really part of the locker room. And OBJ, I mean, he's always about himself. So I mean, that these two guys are on different planets is not surprising in the least bit.
Can't really ignore this story. What's your assessment of the Kaepernick, whatever you want to call it, workout?
I mean, I think it's ridiculous that it was hastily arranged like it has been. There's no excuse why this hasn't happened before, why it didn't happen in the offseason, why it didn't happen on like a Tuesday. It just, all of it feels wrong. I think all of this has been unfair to Colin, who certainly you look at some of the situations at quarterback around the league. He could certainly play in this league in some sort of function, certainly as a backup. And that it's taken him this long to get a real chance from anybody is kind of ridiculous to me.
Visiting with Greg Bedard of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Boston Sports Journal, Jimmy Garoppolo, 49ers, Shanahan, your assessment of the 49ers in the aftermath of that game. Of course, it's overreaction, but what's your assessment of that team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still a good team. I think that Shanahan's a good coach. I think what we saw was, sort of a typical, almost like last night's game and a lot of these Thursday night games. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was was that Monday night? Sorry,
right.
A typical divisional game where the two teams know each other really well, and it turned into a defensive struggle. And you get a lot of those. I mean, look at, when Tom Brady goes to Buffalo. I mean, the Patriots beat the Bills 16-10 this year, and Brady was terrible in that game. I mean, did anybody come out of that game saying that Tom Brady's finished? Of course not. Jimmy had a rough night. He got sped up early from pressure. He was not protected well. Staley and McGlinchey did not do a good job on the edges. When you get pressure early on a quarterback, especially a young one, they get sped up and they can't really get slowed down, and that's what happened to Jimmy. And he made some really good plays in that game. He made some really terrible plays, but he's young in his career. He'll learn the more times he's in these situations. And, I think that's still a really good team that is going to be tough to beat in the NFC.
Is he a high ceiling guy, Jimmy, at the end of the day?
That's a good question. I don't know if he's a high ceiling guy. I mean, I think he's certainly a guy that can win you a title. Would I put him in the same category as like a Mahomes, who I would consider a high ceiling guy? No, but I think he has the potential, if he stays healthy, to certainly be in that second rung of guys who are very good quarterbacks and who you can win a Super Bowl title with.
Visiting with Greg Bedard of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Boston Sports Journal. Last thing I want to ask you about the big game between the Patriots and Eagles.
Yep.
We had some great analysis on the interior line of all things and how that may play out. Some really compelling stuff. Talk about that matchup on the interior line, specifically as we look at the Eagles-Patriots matchup.
Yeah, I think, the way I look at those two teams and the way they're playing right now, I think that the matchup of the game could be the Patriots right guard Shaq Mason against Fletcher Cox of the Eagles. Cox has certainly been one of the best interior defensive linemen in the league for many years. He had major foot surgery in the offseason, got off to a bit of a slow start, but he's playing some of his best ball in the past couple of games. Shaq Mason is a guy who was nearly all-pro level last season. He got a big contract extension from the Patriots last year. He is off to a tough start this year. No one's exactly saying why. I mean, it's the Patriots, so they don't. I think that he's been hurt all year. I saw him in the locker room yesterday. He was limping a little bit. I think he's got a right knee injury that he's been dealing with, maybe meniscus that's going to have to be taken care of in the offseason. But if he's not, he played better against the Ravens, and they had the bye week, so perhaps he's rested and ready. He better be, because the way Cox is playing right now, he has a chance to completely wreck the game on Sunday, and so they need Mason to be good. I don't have a lot of optimism about it, but that's certainly a battle to watch in that game.
How big of a correction might we see from the Patriots second half of the season for them? Or a correction at all, or if you want to call it a correction, maybe this is the team, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to tell. Certainly, I mean, when we looked at the schedule before the season, we knew 8-0 was pretty much in their wheelhouse with the way the schedule lined up. And then it was, you had 5 games, and this will be the second of those 5 games. I think to me, having been an observer of this team, I think that the Ravens game was an outlier. I think it was a team, it was a Ravens team coming off a bye with an unconventional offense that's tough to get prepared for on a regular week, and they had some issues. But I think that they would do much better in a rematch. I'm more worried about the Patriots offense than anything else. I think the defense can defend anybody. They'll be better against Jackson the second time around. But the offense, I don't know. They're really lacking in big play players. No Gronkowski. They don't really have any speed on the outside. They're challenged, and so if the other team can get into the 20s against the Patriots defense, it's about a 50-50 proposition whether the offense is going to do the same thing for the Patriots.
It's going to be interesting. Thanks so much for jumping on. I really appreciate it, Greg. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
That's Greg Bedard of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Boston Sports Journal, giving us the national perspective, giving us the perspective on a guy that goes and covers the New England Patriots on essentially a beat basis as well. So it doesn't get any better than that as we're going into the second half of the season, if you want to call it that, probably the closest thing to it as far as the Patriots are concerned going forward. But that Shaq Mason, Fletcher Cox matchup and the interior line, a very, very compelling angle that Greg struck upon in his coverage at Boston Sports Journal. If you're a football fan and you want to know what's going on with the Patriots, I highly suggest you go to the Boston Sports Journal and subscribe. Independent coverage, separated. You don't have that sort of incestuous relationship between the media and teams. That's one of the great things about some of the independent sites that have been spawned over the years in big cities and small cities too, covering the local teams. And certainly the epitome of that is what Greg Bedard has started with the Boston Sports Journal. So I want you to go take a look at that. We thank Greg for coming on, friend of the show. He's been on before, and hopefully he'll be on again. But we've got a lot more coverage of the Garrett situation with Mason Rudolph. And as I alluded to a little bit with Greg, where I'm coming from on it, I absolutely concur with 95% of what he's saying when it comes to assessing the situation, to get the vapors over it, as to how bad it was. That's a joke, because some of the things that go on within the confines of the game, and by the way, this is still in the confine of the game. When you have uniforms on, when you're on the field, when you're in the stadium, and what took place in that incident, right, came out of the confrontation within the confines of a live play. There's no doubt about it. There's no vacuum there. That either took place, that incident, based on what had just taken place during the confrontation physically between Rudolph and or Steelers and Garrett. Understand that. You can't look at it in a vacuum. Oh, it just happened. Now, this is not something that's all that unusual. I mean, the nature of hitting somebody with their own helmet, that's different. I recognize that. But this is a guy who has punched players this season. This is a guy who put Trevor Siemian out for the year, regardless of how that play worked out because of a late hit. And we're talking about Myles Garrett. This is not something that's way out there, an aberration as far as he is concerned. You know, whether he's a good guy or not, to me, it's really immaterial. What happened, happened. Now, we have some clips here, and I'm assuming at this point, if you're watching Sports by Brooks on FanCred, you've probably seen what took place. What we want to show you are some of the other things surrounding that play that you probably haven't seen or you may not be even aware of. And one of the things I want to get to with our producer, Cameron Smith, today is I want to get to what took place immediately before Myles Garrett went on and took Rudolph's helmet off and eventually hit him with it. What took place immediately prior to that incident? And so clip number 2, Cameron, I think Cam Smith, our producer, I think is the clip where we have Mason Rudolph trying to pull Myles Garrett's helmet off. If we have that clip, that would be great. And so you can see what took place just before. Watch this. Now watch. Same play. You heard Joe Buck say it. Right. Not to mention, seconds later, I didn't think it was necessarily that significant to show you, but it could be. But as Mason Rudolph is on the ground, he had his foot right into the groin of Myles Garrett. I'm not saying that he kicked him in the groin. There's no real indication that took place. Maybe it was a coincidence. It might not have been, as Rudolph was trying to get off the ground. But we don't know necessarily what was said between those guys. And I'm not going to qualify it in anything that I'm going to say. I'm not going to keep going on and on and on about, I'm not excusing it. That's the only time I'm going to say it. All right. That qualification, just that one time. So also, I want to run back. You're going to hear all manner of responses, and I'm going to give you my ultimate judgment on this in a second. But I wanted to give you a response from the former director of officiating with the NFL, Mike Pereira. Mike Pereira, you know who he is. He came on Fox in the aftermath of this incident. That's clip number 3, Cam. Go ahead and try to play that clip from Mike Pereira on Fox.
Situation will be looked. I think easy. It's absolutely it as a weapon, but to me, Garrett is going to have a pretty lengthy suspension, and not just because of what he did tonight. I mean, you got to go back and look at this season. He's already been fined twice for hits on the quarterback, and now you take this incident, and so I'm not going to be surprised if we don't see something that could approach 4 games. I don't know how long, that they have gone before for an incident like this, but I think 4 games is probably going to be what they do. It could get reduced because certainly the player can appeal the fine, but I just don't see it. And Pouncey, too, where his kicking and just swinging, I mean, again, this goes beyond pretty much anything that I have seen. What will happen is they got some time. That's the thing, because neither team plays until the following week. So I wouldn't look for a decision to be made until maybe Monday or early Tuesday. But again, this used to come to me when I was a head of officiating, and then I would look at it, and then I would refer it up to. I called
the decision has been
for
made
them to make the final decision.
Already came down just moments ago after we got on the air. I'm going to read you the statement from the NFL that was released in regards to Myles Garrett and others as to what the punishment is, at least for now, because the punishment for Garrett is listed as indefinite. So let me read you the statement that has come down from the NFL. The Pittsburgh Steelers and Cleveland Browns organizations have each been fined $250,000, and 3 players, Cleveland's Myles Garrett and Larry Ogajumbi. All right, let me. And Pittsburgh's Marquise Pouncey have been suspended without pay for their actions in Thursday night's game. Garrett has been suspended without pay indefinitely, at a minimum, for the remainder of the regular season and postseason, and must meet with the commissioner's office prior to a decision on his reinstatement. He will also be fined an additional amount. Garrett violated unnecessary roughness and unsportsmanlike conduct rules, as well as fighting, removing the helmet of an opponent, and using the helmet as a weapon. Pouncey has been suspended games and fined an additional amount for unnecessary roughness, specifically for shoving an opposing player to the ground during an altercation. Under the collective bargaining agreement, the suspensions may be appealed within 3 business days. Appeals are heard and decided by either Derek Brooks or James Thrash, the officers jointly appointed and compensated by the NFL and NFLPA to decide appeals of on-field discipline. So again, Myles Garrett has been suspended without pay indefinitely at a minimum for the remainder of the season and the postseason, and must meet with the commissioner's office prior to a decision on his reinstatement. He was also fined an additional amount. Garrett violated unnecessary roughness and unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, as well as fighting, removing the helmet of an opponent, and using the helmet as a weapon. So that's where we are right now, and that's the complete statement from the National Football League. You are up to date as far as that situation is concerned, and you heard Mike Pereira talk about it briefly on the clip that we played you. We want to also have Mason Rudolph weigh in on the situation. If you didn't see his response, it was very brief and to the point. Cam, if you have that clip number 5, and that involves Mason Rudolph's reaction to the situation when he was asked about it.
I know, on his part, I'm not going to back down for bully.
So he called him a bully and he called him a coward. So that's the situation there. And I think we have trying to get the other clip up there here in a moment. But at the very least, what I wanted to get a chance to do, because we do have some guests coming up. We've got Daniel Roberts coming up from Yahoo, who is a sports business and media guru, and has some news for us on the front involving the Astros and the Kaepernick situation as well. We'll talk to Daniel here in a moment about those situations. Also, of course, want to get his response on the Garrett and Rudolph situation. But also, we'll be talking to Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a columnist and talk show host, does nights on sports radio in Pittsburgh. We'll be talking to Paul coming up later in the show, friend of the show. He's been on before. And Chad Finn. We wanted to get a guy to give us the sports media perspective, sports media columnist for the Boston Globe. Chad Finn will be joining us coming up as well. But I did want to really weigh in before we get to anything else on my thoughts on it, because I hinted about it a little bit with Greg. Wanted to make sure I gave Greg the platform, got him on as a guest, get his perspective. I really think the NFL has nailed the situation perfectly, come out quickly and strongly, and suspended Garrett properly for the remainder of the season, regular season, postseason, without pay. Right thing to do. In my opinion, he should be suspended for the equivalent, this is Garrett, of a full season. And that would entail potentially 10 more games, probably, unless the Browns somehow make the playoffs this year. They've got 6 regular season games left. 10 more games next season. That's my opinion, because this is unprecedented. This is different. We have not seen anything like this to this extent. Something that was this overt, this deliberate, this barbarous. Now, is the game barbarous? Absolutely. Is to a certain extent what I'm saying hypocritical in my judgment of what Garrett has done? Yes, it is hypocritical. Greg made a great point. I'm glad he came on and made the point. It's an unbelievably violent game. It's a blood sport. Earlier in the game, we had a collision, helmet to helmet, blood coming out of the ear in the aftermath. All right. God knows we've seen horrible things on the field. But here's the thing. Football is at the center of our culture now. It's not peripheral. It's right in the middle. Everybody's talking, and the proof of that is everybody's talking about it on CNN, MSNBC, you name it, Fox News. It's everywhere today. It's all over Twitter. It's inescapable. And with that in mind, when you have a game that is as barbarous as pro football is, borderline spectacle, gladiatorial, and it's miraculous that this hasn't happened like this before. I think it's extremely important for the commissioner and people that run the NFL to come out and make a strong statement, draw a bright, very bright line here. This is totally intolerable. All right? Totally. Again, in the context of the game itself, in the context of what's happened off the field with players, right? I get it. It's hypocritical what I'm saying. I do understand what you're saying. In the grand scheme of things, I totally get Greg Bedard's side of it. All right? But we're in a situation where we haven't seen anything like this before. And it isn't like the NFL doesn't have cover to do this. It certainly does, because a lot of people who've been around the game a long time, like Mike Florio, Adam Schefter, they're calling for what a lot of people would regard as draconian punishments. A lot of people, though, are going to look at those guys, and I'm already hearing them saying, well, look, the game's already barbarous, awful. Things that happen on the field are just as bad, right? Yeah, I mean, look what happened earlier this season involving Mason Rudolph himself and Earl Thomas of the Ravens. Do we have that clip? I think we have that clip of Earl Thomas knocking Mason Rudolph out. If you could play that clip, that'd be great, Cam. So there is Mason Rudolph being knocked cold. He had to have his face mask removed and the helmet taken off of him after that hit, right? What's the difference? There is no difference. There really isn't. There really isn't. At the end of the day, I don't think there is. I mean, I will say this. The difference is that Mason Rudolph wasn't knocked out last night, but goodness knows what is going to be the long-term impact and effect of that hit on him. You don't even want to contemplate that. So my overriding point here is that couldn't be more pleased with the response of the NFL in this situation. This is an unprecedented situation. It's not like other situations. Just recognize that for what it is. Is football a violent game? Yes. Is it a surprise this happened? No. The surprise is that it hasn't happened like this in the past. But do we need to really make a statement now about this sort of conduct, or misconduct? Absolutely, we do at this point. This is completely and totally unacceptable. And if you don't do that, you're setting an extremely dangerous precedent. And I hate to invoke think of the children, but think of the children, okay? And think of the adults coaching the children. So let's now take a look at the clip. Now, setting this up, we've got Baker Mayfield on the field with Aaron Andrews after the game teammate of Myles Garrett. Let's go ahead and play that clip, Cam. This is Baker Mayfield's response, first blush after the game.
I don't care. That's you're lately hurting yourself, and that's just endangering who does now.
Yeah, the
You know, defense gets that. Not even close.
Yeah, again, I'm really glad that we were able to get Greg Bedard on early on. I'm interested to hear what Chad Finn thinks of the Boston Globe, Daniel Roberts here coming up of Yahoo Finance, and Paul Zeiss of Pittsburgh's Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, columnist there. And Paul also is a weeknight radio host, sports radio host in Pittsburgh. Going to be fascinating to get their perspectives on this subject. But clearly, Greg thought it probably wasn't a great idea, the nature of the comments that came from Baker Mayfield. I happen to disagree. I think Baker Mayfield did the right thing. I think the NFL's done the right thing. And now we're going to bring in Daniel Roberts from Yahoo, who is a sports business expert, finance expert, gives us kind of a different perspective on the big story of the day. And he was able to glean some things about the Astros situation, that cheating situation earlier this week, and we'll talk about in a moment, and the Kaepernick situation. But first, Daniel, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure, Brooks. Good to see you again.
What a day. At least to me, what a day. This is an unprecedented situation that we've got with Myles Garrett and Mason Rudolph. I mean, what's your response to what happened?
Well, look, I mean, the league moved fast, and people can applaud that, but also what choice did it have? I mean, this was the obvious move, the suspension for the rest of the year. I noticed that the report also says the playoffs. I don't think the Browns are going to the playoffs, but, you know, that settles that. Yeah, and I heard you talking about what Baker Mayfield said. I thought that was another sort of easy move for him. You know, people can criticize, I saw some sniping like, oh, he threw his teammate under the bus, but pretty easy for him to say what he said in the moment. And if you think about it, I'm not saying that his first priority should be his personal brand, and I'm not even saying that he necessarily thought about that before he made the comments, but I think it's positive for Baker. I think it makes him look good. And, you know, he's been criticized a lot this season, rightfully so. So that was an easy decision. The league moving quickly to suspend Garrett for the rest of the year was an easy decision. It would have been pretty heavily criticized for anything else. I also don't think you'll see that many people criticizing the league for being too harsh on Garrett. So that was an easy move. I'm hesitant to over applaud that, but that was the right move.
So excuse me for being cynical on this, but had this not been a high profile game, perhaps, or maybe a quarterback, right? The nature of a Mason Rudolph, something that is that overt, might we not be seeing this sort of response? Maybe if this happened in the interior line, if you will.
Right. I mean, it's tempting to think that, or, you know, if it happened on a Sunday local 1 p.m. game that wasn't the national primetime game, maybe. But boy, the video is just so damning. You know, when you see, especially a lot of people are tweeting and saying, "Oh, watch it in slow-mo." Just the pounding of the helmet right onto the crown of the head. I mean, with everything that's gone on and all the discussion about head injuries, and it was an easy one. I think if it had been someone else and it wasn't a defender doing it to a quarterback, I think probably you still would have seen the same move. And also, I don't think it's too cynical to bring in the current, I don't want to say scandal, but Kaepernick issue, story, discussion, because you could think that influenced the league's thinking here. It was like, we're being slammed this week over this Kaepernick thing. People are accusing it of being an empty publicity stunt. Here's another issue, another headache. Well, let's just go full punishment. He's out, done right away, swift to handle that.
Very, very interesting to hear your response and you characterizing it as easy, because I agree with you. I think it absolutely is a lockdown thing to do it this way. But we're also seeing some NFL media out there saying, hey, aren't we being hypocritical here? This is a blood sport. This is a gladiatorial sport already. These kinds of things, to a certain extent, happen anyway. What about those people? How do you address those people? Because they're out there, Daniel.
Yeah, I know. But there are rules. And that's a pretty big extrapolation. Like, well, it's a violent sport, so now you're over punishing for violence. Well, no, it's a violent sport even when it's played within the rules, but at least you follow the rules of the sport and the guidelines, and you try to make it as safe as possible. Now, I know people say the word safe shouldn't even be used in the context of the NFL. That's such an oxymoron. There's no such thing as kind of making this sport safe. And I agree with that in terms of, I mean, watch what is happening to these guys later in life. Totally. And it's a major issue, although I don't think anyone really, NFL's not going anywhere. But you at least try to not allow players to behave in that way. And to, if someone gets injured on a play, in the course of a regular play, fine. But this was disgusting. I mean, this was a display you don't often see in football. I mean, by the way, you saw the Reggie Bush tweet, which of all people, that's kind of funny. But, Reggie Bush tweeted out, it was like, I have never in my life seen anything like this on it. And then he said, this isn't what football's about. Right. So I just don't really see how you can defend any part of what happened.
Yeah, and as I've said before, I think we're going right up to the line of barbarity in this sport already, a sport that has moved to the center of our culture just in my lifetime. So I think if there's ever been a moment where Roger Goodell needs to, not just an easy thing, but needs to draw a very, very bright line in this unprecedented situation, it's now. We're talking to Daniel Roberts of Yahoo, and you mentioned Kaepernick, and I know you did like 6 live hits the other day from the Paley Center. That was really fascinating, the day that you had on your streaming show, which is weekdays, of course. But one of the subjects, one of the topics with James Brown and Colin Kaepernick, and you alluded to it, is it a PR stunt? What is your perspective on the legal side of it? Do you think that the legal side of it here could be also fueling why the NFL is putting this together?
Well, I mean, I certainly think it's possible. I do think that it's hard to really know. I mean, and I don't have the sort of inside the league sourcing that people like Adam Schefter have and others. I will say, I think some people in their response and instantly slamming the whole thing and saying, what a joke. And some people are even going so far as to say, Kaepernick shouldn't go. He shouldn't participate. I think they're missing something. It's not mutually exclusive to think that the league set it up. I mean, why wasn't it a specific team? It's the league set it up. And why is it on a Saturday, by the way, when head coaches can't come? So all that is fair. So the league set it up, and maybe it was an effort that the league came up with to be like, things are going so well this season and we've gotten away from the political controversy. Let's go for another win. And maybe it kind of bit off more than it could chew. But A, the league set it up. Sure. You want to use the word stunt, fine. But B, that doesn't necessarily mean that he shouldn't go and that he won't get a fair look and that there won't be scouts who will really consider him. I mean, even if it is even if it was set up as an empty PR gesture by the league, well, Kaepernick, who, by the way, I really appreciate his humility. I mean, I really, separate from, whatever your politics are, I think he's very upstanding and heroic and genuine. It looks like he's positive about it, optimistic about it. He's going to go. And even if it was set up as a publicity stunt, well, we know that at least 11 teams are sending reps. I'm not going to say that none of them, that it's all empty and vacuous and none of the reps going are actually really going to consider signing him. I mean, what if he has a great day? So
yeah, well, and I put it in this context. Think about the Civil Rights Act and LBJ, and in the aftermath of that, people have always said, well, he just wanted to get black people to vote Democratic, or he had these ulterior motives. Well, he may have had those motives, but it was still the right thing to do. And It worked out good. And I think it's a little bit like what you're talking about. And in fact, that's almost every decision that's ever made. There's always ulterior motives in almost everything. So if you're hung up by that, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned yesterday I spoke to James Brown of CBS, who everyone knows and recognizes, a veteran. And I appreciated his kind of candid answer about Kaepernick because he is a guy who, what they do, they don't normally in any way on TV get in any way partisan. They don't want to touch political issues or topics. They barely would have any reason even on air to talk about Kaepernick in a CBS halftime show. They just want to talk about what is happening in the action on the field. But it was great to get his perspective. I asked him, is this legit? And his commentary, he said, well, everyone is saying it's a PR stunt. He said, what PR person would suggest this to the league in week 10 in the middle of the season when things are actually going so well for the league? It's been a great season. Ratings are doing okay. And when the league has gotten past the sort of Kaepernick kneeling 2 seasons of
but has it
to this, they would be an idiot. And I sort of agree with that. Now, I don't think it wasn't maybe it was a PR stunt that already has gone wrong. But again, that doesn't mean he shouldn't. Doesn't mean he won't get a fair.
Now, I think the underlying point is the legal part of it. And the fact, here's the other thing. Remember the statement that Kaepernick's agent put out, Jeff Nowley, where he detailed out all of those things. And I think that may have been a response. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that there could be motivation here underneath the surface that could be trying to head off any potential litigation in the future. That's possible. But at the end of the day, we're really now going to find out. I really think legitimately if there are some teams out there because of this cover that will seriously consider signing Colin Kaepernick, which I think is a good thing. It needs to happen. And I think ultimately is going to be a real positive for the league if he ends up on a team ultimately in the end. Visiting with Dan.
There's certainly teams, Brooks, that need someone. Certainly.
Right.
Whether it's a starter or a back.
Point.
I mean, to say that there's no room for him in the league is really stupid, especially in the season where the talk is about Lamar Jackson. I mean, hello, Kaepernick's style is really it is being proven out right now this season. You saw, by the way, that Trae Young in the NBA tweeted out and was like, your apologies to me have to be as loud as your doubt was. All the cheers to the haters because he's having a good season. And then Lamar Jackson responded and said, right. Because he's talking about himself, too, because people said Lamar couldn't be good in the league. Wrong. Yeah. So, and by the way, at this point, removed from the controversy by a year or whatever it's been since, no one is still trying to argue that Kaepernick wasn't blacklisted. Come on. He was blacklisted, you know?
Well, what's funny is what is Kaepernick 10 years younger than Tom Brady? I'm not comparing him to Tom. I guess I am, but he's 10 years younger than Tom Brady. And the other, to your point, it's not just Lamar Jackson. It's Russell Wilson. It's Deshaun Watson, right? Yep. It's a new era of quarterback. And so there's absolutely no reason why he should not be on a team and on a roster. Visiting with Daniel Roberts here of Yahoo Finance. And we're going to move over now to baseball because you kind of had an incredible break today, or at least this week, as you interviewed Rob Manfred, the commissioner of baseball. Got a chance to drill down a little bit where a lot of people haven't been able to drill down and exactly what his thoughts are right now about what appears to be a cheating scandal involving the Astros. So what did you find out from Rob Manfred on your Yahoo show?
Yeah, so he was at the Paley Center, and I appreciated that he sat down with us still because certain other commissioners were at this event and their people said, no way, no interview. So, usually I think the playbook for commissioners of a big league or a big CEO, when there's a current thing in the news that is negative going on, they say, no, and they cancel all appearances and they say no media. But Manfred still sat down with us. Now, that said, he didn't say anything too earth-shattering. He said, I guess what you'd expect. But I did push him a little more. He started by saying, we take this very seriously. He said, obviously, following the rules is crucial to the competition on the field. And by the way, Manfred's a lawyer. He's he comes from a legal background. He knows how to phrase things. So he's being very judicious and careful. But he said, we're investigating. And I thought the key interesting thing in the first part of what he said was, we're investigating. We're trying to understand what happened and who was involved and how high up in the organization it went. And I thought that was interesting because, of course, it went pretty high in the organization, I suspect. To me, what's more interesting is how low in the organization did it go? And what I mean by that is this is the kind of thing that it couldn't have just been, it was Jeff Lunau and AJ Hinch and one guy, some junior staffer like with Spygate, with Spygate with the Patriots. And I'm a Patriots fan, but I don't deny that happened, and that was horrible. It was employees of like Bob Kraft's video company who were sent over to do the video. I don't think that the players knew. But the nature of this Astros thing, a ton, if not all, of the players on the team knew and were complicit. I mean, batters had to know because the batters were told, if you hear bang, bang, it's a changeup, get ready. So that is why, to me, it's so troubling. It would be less troubling if it was like just two of the executives, but all the players, man. So that's why it's very troubling. And he said, we want to find out how high up in the organization it went.
Think about this. You're telling me they're banging on the dugout, wherever they are, the ceiling or on a bench, and Jeff Lunau would be in the vicinity of that. And that wouldn't come up?
Right. Come on.
Jeff Lunau wouldn't be saying, what's going on? Why do we have this banging?
And this is the guy who already has a checkered past with tech-related scandals. Come on.
Right. And to me, the most interesting part of this whole scenario that I think when we go back and we look at this story, because we've been through this so many times, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And the video that we have right now, every word that is coming out of the mouth of Jeff Lunau is going to be played back in perpetuity based, I think, on what we're going to find out over the next 3 to 6 months. And I'm not so sure that he's going to reside or he's going to survive in his job, because anything that he says, doesn't matter what he says, I just can't imagine a scenario where he would not know about this, yet he's addressing it. We're going to investigate it. So when you hear him dealing with it and knowing what we know about the nature of this cheating, and then you hear what the commissioner has said, and the animus that there is for the Astros around the league, that you have current players, that to me is a real breakthrough here. Current players are accusing the Astros of this thing. I think this is a perfect storm. I mean, how do you think ultimately this could play out as far as the Astros are concerned, whether it involves Hinch and Lunau personally, and also what it could mean in the future in terms of, I love the word prophylactic. That was the highlight. But the prophylactic nature of what we might have going forward. Could this be something where, maybe not retroactively, but you could have a World Series title be in jeopardy if this were to take place in the future? Right.
Well, so I'm with you. And the next question, the question has already moved. It's no longer, did this happen? Clearly it happened. Come on. Clearly this was going on. So as Manfred said, who was involved, who knew about it? It's always about who knew and when did they know. And he said, we're investigating. We want to see how high up it goes. And then I pushed him a little further. I didn't want to make the whole interview about the Astros, but I said, well, once you find things out, what kind of punishment could we see? Because you have a problem of fan trust being eroded. And he said, when we, do a punishment for something like this, we want it to be prophylactic. So i.e. that it's so severe that it'll prevent anyone from ever doing anything like this again. And I do think the conversation now moves toward what could the punishment be. So, I mean, on the high end, maybe they have to vacate their title. I can't think of a time that's happened with Major League Baseball, but it happens all the time with.
You think that's possible?
I think it's possible. I don't want to say it's not possible. I think it's extremely unlikely. It's extremely unlikely because let's say they find out that 6 or 7 or 8 different players knew about it. That's still, if you take away the title, you're punishing people who weren't involved in this and didn't cheat. And I don't see it happening, but I don't think it's impossible. One step below vacate the title. And I was just going to say, we know that happens all the time with the NCAA. And people think it's stupid. Come on, they still won those games. Penn State won those games. Louisville won those games. You can't vacate. It's a symbolic gesture, but not something I've ever seen in Major League Baseball. In terms of severity would be an asterisk. Look at Barry Bonds. The ball goes to the Hall of Fame, or not maybe it's Cooperstown, but an asterisk on it. Maybe forever the 2017 Astros title has an asterisk. Lower end of the spectrum in terms of severity, a fine, which would be, even if it's a really big fine, what does that do? So maybe some of these guys get suspended or banned. Look over at Silver and what he did with Don Sterling. Maybe you ban Jeff Lunau. Maybe you ban, unfortunately, A.J. Hinch if he condoned it. If he was, telling guys, assigning, hey, do this, bang on the trash can. That would be something that would certainly be very, very severe, but it would sort of getting rid of the title. I don't know.
I mean, I think just the fact that they're banging on a trash can or they're whistling, remember recently this season, and then you have these brazen denials, right? And we're to believe. And then we have Jeff Lunau saying we're going to investigate. Yeah, it is. It's
And
laughable.
they called
Well,
the
we're
Yankees-
laughing about it, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, and he famously responded to the Yankees whistling claim saying it's so ridiculous. And if we had known that whistling would throw them off, we would have practiced it. It's like, come on.
So yeah, and now you have players that are currently in the major leagues, and shoes are going to continue to drop. We've got the Beltran situation, the Cora situation. What do you think might play out there?
Well, look, I mean, Cora, it's funny. Now you get a trend of players who only just retired becoming managers, and they've been very successful. That trend is also happening in the NBA and college. With, Jerry Stackhouse is going over to Coach Vandy. I mean, all these guys who haven't been out of the league that long are becoming coaches. It's happening in NBA. It's happening in Major League Baseball. Cora's been very successful, obviously. And we know over at the Yankees that another former player been very successful, Mr. Boone. I'm sorry to say, as a Red Sox fan, it hurts me to have, the Boones coming to, you remember the Boone homer that killed us? And his brother's in the booth announcing it. That sucked. Yeah. But the point is, we know via a report yesterday that now the net of the MLB investigation is expanding to talk to Cora, to talk to other players, 2017 Astros organization. So if you're Cora and you get interviewed about this, you're no longer on the Astros. You want to be truthful, but if you think about it, what if it implicates him? It's almost like, do you plead the fifth? Because if he says, yep, this was happening, well, then it implicates him because he was a bench coach on the 2017 Astros. So I don't know. I mean, as you and I were saying, it's like the reason this is such a scandal, it isn't even just the cheating and the fact that the team won a World Series. It's the potential breadth of how many guys were complicit in it, were agreeing to it. Now, of course, what someone could say in defense is, if you're a pitcher and you're traded to the Astros and you get there and they say, or maybe not a pitcher, I'm sorry, a batter. You're a player and you bat, and they say, hey, listen, by the way, don't worry too much about it. I mean, I don't know what they said to them, but don't worry. But listen, when you're a bat, if you hear two bangs on a drum, listen up. It's the changeup, and you should adjust accordingly. I think it's maybe too high of a bar to expect guys to say, wait a minute, that's cheating. I'm not going to participate in that. Who's going to say that? It's their new team. Tough.
What about the defense? If you have a first base coach who is able to see a catcher's signals, and he goes to a batter on his own team and says, "Hey, I've got the signals. I can tip you off. I can, put my finger to my cap, Bill. Whatever it is. Do you want that?" I mean, is the bottom line in all of this that the electronic nature of it, that it's happening outside the context of the game? But do you have a defense? I mean, is that, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the defense that comes up ultimately. What's the difference?
That wouldn't be a good enough defense, because the situation you described, people have thought that goes on already for years. Now, that too is cheating, but people do that. Once you think you figure out the science, why do in football they cover the face because they don't want someone out there is looking to see my mouth and try and read my mouth. That stuff happens. But having a camera in the outfield pointed at the cat, they had an elaborate system in place that used tech. So I think it's just so much more egregious. There's no defense.
Last thing for you, Daniel. Daniel Roberts is with us from Yahoo, and but you brought up an interesting question with Rob Manfred, and he kind of skirted the issue a little bit based on the nature of your question. But you were talking about umpiring and the automation, that word of umpiring, almost implying robot umpires. What was the response when you kind of pressed Rob Manfred about the prospect of an electronic umpire?
Yeah, and ironically, the issue that is now coming to the fore, like people have been talking about, robot umpires, automated strike zone for a while now, and the league had already publicly said we're experimenting with automated strike zone. But the call in Game 6 of the World Series that has brought the issue back is really more about instant replay. And when can we watch instant replay? When will they review something? When is it reviewable? When is it challengeable? Can you challenge? That's what came up with the interference call, with the Nats runner being called out at first, and pretty much across the board, everyone agrees, like, that was the wrong call. Now, maybe according to the minutia and the current rules as written, it was the right call, but it's stupid. It's just common sense. I mean, all these players, the Cubs slugger, among others, had tweeted out just minutes later, like, that's ridiculous that he was called out. But if you remember, first the call was made, everyone said, oh my God, bad call. Then there was like 10 minutes of waiting. And everyone said, well, oh, so are they reviewing it? And then they confirmed the call, and everyone said, oh, my God, well, what was the point of the review? And then it turned out later they weren't reviewing it. It wasn't reviewable on replay. There was just like a delay with the replay system. All kinds of problems. And I just said to Manfred, did that bring this issue back to the fore, and what are you doing? He admitted, and I'm not going to say this was the first time, he had probably said this before somewhere, but he said that moment didn't go so well. He said that call didn't go so well. And then he said, but ironically, he said, interestingly, that call was not reviewable on replay. So what was happening was not replay. It was that there was a delay in the replay system. So, oh my God. So as if all this isn't bad enough, they had like a tech glitch. But then he said, as far as automation goes, we have been experimenting with an automated strike zone, and we're seeing a lot of good results. And he said, we really think that could improve the game, but we're probably a couple of years out still from implementing that. I mean, think how long we've also heard about the pitch clock. Oh, it's coming, the pitch clock, and now it's in the minor leagues, but we're still not seeing the pitch clock in the majors. I'll believe it when I see it. So they know about these complaints. They're experimenting, but at the same time, I think it would be a long time before we see like no more human umpires in the game. I just don't, and I'm a little bit like an old school purist in some ways. I think I like, it's a human thing. Sometimes they make errors. It's a really hard job.
Well, hey, you know what I think of? I think of the chain gang in football. Why don't we have lasers?
Right.
Why don't we have automation? Why don't we have a chip in the football and on the field? Why do we have these old guys from the chain gang, right, going out there? Isn't it kind of the same principle?
Well, absolutely. They're just eyeballing it. It's so imprecise. But I do think that, yeah, it's the same principle, but I kind of feel different. I don't necessarily have the same opinion across the board of automate everything. I think in some ways, if it's all just tech, a little bit it ruins kind of the purity of the sport. But I agree with your example. I keep thinking, if we can throw the pretty accurate, I know it's an estimate, but the pretty accurate yellow first down line on TV, well, why can't they just make the field have sensors and be able to tell exactly where the ball was put down? Have you been, Brooks, to Topgolf? You hit balls at Topgolf, and sensors on the ground where you're driving your balls figure out exactly how far your ball went. Just lay that under all the football fields.
Right. Why not? We got the technology already, So, hey, I can't thank you enough. It's outstanding stuff. Great show. Really enjoy your show at the Yahoo Finance. You do a wonderful job. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Enjoy your show. I'll talk to you again soon, buddy.
And that's Daniel Roberts of Yahoo, and he's at Read Dan Writes. Read Dan Writes. Read Dan Writes, one word. Did I say Read Dan Writes? At Twitter. That's his Twitter handle. So we're going to be visiting coming up with Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, talking to him about what happened last night. Good God. The great conversation, though, by the way, with Daniel Roberts. Always great. And they do a streaming show over at Yahoo Finance. So go, just type in Yahoo Finance and you'll find it. He's there, ever present. But we're going to get back into the Myles Garrett, Mason Rudolph thing with Paul Zeiss, who's very opinionated about this stuff. And he's an evening host, a weekday host on sports radio in Pittsburgh. So, and he's a columnist for the Post-Gazette. So we have a best of both worlds there from Paul Zeiss. So he'll be joining us. And also hoping to visit with Chad Finn of the Boston Globe. We'll give it a shot with him and talk with him about what's happened, what his opinion is of what took place last night from a sports media perspective as well. And I want to get into some other sports media subjects and topics with him as one of the leading sports media guys in the country, based out of New England, Chad Finn. But we've been talking quite a bit about the Rudolph Garrett situation, and we've run back some clips for you. We've given you some background. One thing I wanted to talk about briefly, which really doesn't relate to that situation precisely, but just watching the Steelers last night. And I think there's a perception out there right now going into the game. Of course, the Steelers coming off the big win over the Rams, where the defense had played so well. Coming into this game 5-4, and it's not like the Browns outside of the first quarter played all that well. Cleveland played all right. Defensive front for the Browns, and the secondary played pretty damn well last night. That said, there's been a lot of people saying, well, the Minka Fitzpatrick thing, that was a great idea. And look at the Steelers. Now they're resurging, and they made that trade knowing that they had a good team. I'm talking about the acquisition in which the Steelers gave up a first-round pick in exchange for Minka Fitzpatrick, who obviously has made a huge impact in the takeaway category for the Steelers since coming over. That said, I'm not a buyer when it comes to the Steelers, when it comes to Mason Rudolph, because that trade in many ways was based on the Steelers' thought process as it pertains to Mason Rudolph. I don't care what anybody says. It's linked, and we'll talk to Paul Zeiss about this. I really want to get into this. You've got Ben Roethlisberger, I know, sitting there. He's supposed to come back next year, but God knows, who the hell knows how good he's going to be. I don't know if you guys saw him on the sidelines. all kinds of memes popping up on Twitter, of course, after the images of Ben Roethlisberger last night in the full beard, a beard that really hasn't been manicured in quite some time, if ever. And he's got the big heavy coat on and the stocking cap on the sidelines. And some hilarious memes and remarks about the imagery of Ben Roethlisberger. But you can't count on him coming back. And the issue with him right now is his arm. Is that going to get much better at his age with the surgery that he's undergone, the Tommy John surgery? We'll see. But I think, and we talked about this briefly with Greg Bedard to open the show here on Sports by Brooks on FanCred. I really don't think Mason Rudolph's the guy, and I'm not really hearing that from people in that assessment. I'm still hearing that the jury's out on Mason. No, it's not. It's not out. The guy's stiff as a board. He's not all that accurate. He certainly is not mobile. And I think last night really gave you an example of what that assessment really represents when you look at Baker Mayfield. Now, did Baker Mayfield play that well last night? Not really. First quarter he did, but he made a couple of plays in that first quarter where he showed you pocket awareness, the ability to move around the pocket. Is he an Olympic sprinter? No. But does he have that agility, that mobility, Baker Mayfield? Yes. Does he have the ability to get himself in a position to make throws? Yes. Does he have accuracy? Yes. At times he does. I really think when you look at Baker Mayfield right now, if I'm a Browns fan, I'm buying him. I'm not selling him. I'm not holding him. I'm not shorting him. I'm buying Baker Mayfield stock right now. And this is the time to buy it in a theoretical virtual stock market, I guess. But everybody is dumping on him. Everybody has thrown him overboard. And I really like him. And look, I understand the first quarter and the first couple of series in which they played so well. You've got a scripted situation to an extent. But I just, when he is in position to make throws, he's accurate, very accurate. Obviously, the guy won a Heisman. The guy was the first overall pick. It's not a coincidence. But he also goes beyond that. I think there's some intangibles there. I do see flickers and signs of leadership. Now, some people might have criticized his comments about Myles Garrett last night based upon how it might go over in the locker room, I guess. But when you look at the bottom line problems that Baker Mayfield has right now, I don't think it's, well, he's too short. Well, he's not accurate. Right? I don't think that's what it is. I think it is the inability to get on the same page with the receiving core, particularly Odell Beckham. I don't know what's going on with Odell Beckham Jr., but that's a disaster. It's inexcusable. Last night for the Browns, they're not on the same page. Whether it's Baker Mayfield at times was. At times, but because they're not on the same page when it comes to throwing the football, the receivers in Baker Mayfield, that kills everything. It kills the running game. You've got too many weapons. I mean, to me, ultimately, what should be happening here? What should be happening is Freddie Kitchens should have been elevated offensive coordinator, which he's never been. He should not have been made freaking head coach. John Dorsey, general manager of the Browns, right, got ahead of himself, to say the least, in making Kitchens the head coach. I don't know what he was thinking, but that's what happened. Kitchens should be the offensive coordinator, working with Baker Mayfield 24/7 on the scheme. You could see flickers of it last night that they've increased that relationship, increased that time, but Kitchens is still the head coach. And could that happen? If I was Jimmy Haslam, it would happen. Let's move him back to offensive coordinator. Would that be weird? Yeah. Is Freddie Kitchens as a head coach weird? Yes. It's weirder than moving him back to offensive coordinator and bringing in a head coach, whoever it is, right? There's candidates out there. But you can see the signs of life. If I'm a Browns fan, and here's the thing, you don't have to have Odell Beckham as part of this team going forward to go to a Super Bowl. I think the Browns have that potential. That defense, that defensive front last night was amazing. It was like a tsunami on Rudolph. And not that other quarterbacks couldn't have handled it. They could have. Rudolph, though, last night, sitting duck. Sitting duck. But I want to get into this with Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and I want to talk a little bit about it from his perspective, the Pittsburgh perspective, if you will. And we're going to do that here momentarily as we continue to do an autopsy, if you will. If you haven't heard, Myles Garrett has been suspended indefinitely by the NFL. Kind of an unprecedented move. I haven't been online since it came down, but we'll be talking about that. But we also want to talk to Chad Finn, sports media columnist for the Boston Globe, and get that perspective in addition to some of his observations on sports media in general. And we very much appreciate Chad Finn and Chad's patience. Chad, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, man, for taking the time to do this.
Hey, glad to do it, man. Good to talk to you.
So I want to hear what is your visceral first blush reaction as to what happened last night in the Garrett Rudolph incident? Do we have Chad with us? Can you hear me, Chad? All right. I think we are working with Chad Finn to get him connected. Okay. I think we've got Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who's going to be joining us here shortly. Maybe we'll be able to reconnect with Chad Finn as well, as the Boston Globe beckons as a sports media columnist. We'll definitely have Chad on and get his perspective on the situation at hand, along with some of the other big picture sports media things that I've really wanted to ask him about. So we'll do that here in short order. But we also want to relate to you what's happened, in particular with Myles Garrett and his suspension, which is indefinite and without pay and without precedent. And I'm going to be very interested to hear what the NFLPA says about this. Now, I'm assuming there's already some reaction. We're on the air right now. But I'm going to be very interested to hear a lot of people weigh in on this, because I think this is a serious issue. But not for the reason, I think, that a lot of people view it as being serious in the way that I'm putting it compared to them. I think when you condemn Myles Garrett and you do it in the context of, well, this is, a criminal assault, I think to do it from that perspective alone is not the right way to approach it when you're trying to justify a lengthy suspension or ban on the game as it applies to Myles Garrett. You've got to go further than that, because certainly what happens on a football field, what happens when it comes to a 15-yard penalty, you could qualify as assault. You absolutely could. So to just call it assault, right? Abject, overt assault in relation to what had happened earlier in the game last night, where a player was knocked out, was bleeding out of his ear, remember, because of a helmet-to-helmet hit. I mean, that's assault. But the response is not only different, it's non-existent in the context of what we have now. No, what you've got to do is you've got to point out to people what I did earlier. This game is right up against barbarity, if not over that line, right? I don't think that's an outrageous statement. Gladiatorial blood sport, spectacle, not so much sport, spectacle. Think about it. How many people do you know over the age of 18 who play tackle football without being compensated in some form or fashion? Nobody, because they don't exist. If they do, it's a small group of guys who get together and put the equipment on, I guess, and everybody laughs at them. But that really doesn't exist. There's adult baseball leagues. Of course, there's adult soccer leagues, basketball leagues. You might play basketball in your lunch hour. You don't play tackle football on your lunch hour, right? And by the way, as far as Chad Finn goes, we're going to work with him on reconnecting with him here shortly and get everything that we had hoped to get from him today. In the future, we appreciate Chad Finn, the Boston Globe. He'll be with us here soon. But we also, Monday, hopefully, we'll get a chance to check in with Chad Finn of the Boston Globe, just to let you know as we're working through it. And are we going to have Paul Zeiss on today, or are we just checking in with our producer, Cameron Smith, just to see where we are on that as we continue on here on Sports by Brooks on FanCred. So just let me know about that. And just give me a heads up when we get the opportunity to have Paul on with us, because I think he was scheduled for 1:20 Eastern time, if I'm not mistaken. So, okay. So we'll work with that. And, but as I was saying before, with Myles Garrett, the issue is the fact that football has become so much more important, right? If this was 25 years ago, even on, well, we didn't have Thursday night football games 25 years ago. I don't think we did. Let's say it was Monday Night Football. We might not see this kind of response that we're seeing now. In fact, we probably wouldn't. But because it's so profound now, there has to be a bright line drawn. And I'm going to be discussing that right now with Paul Zeiss, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette weeknight radio host here on 93.7 The Fan in Pittsburgh. So want to get a chance to talk to Paul. Paul, I can't thank you enough. Thanks for hopping on, man. I really appreciate it.
No, anytime. You know that. No problem at all.
So what's your response to what happened last night?
I think that basically, the NFL got it for the most part right. Myles Garrett absolutely should be gone for the season. I don't think there's any question about it. You cannot do that. And I think the most telling thing about it is that all of his coworkers, former players, I can't find one that's realistically even defending him, because there is a certain code that each of these players follow where, our safety is important. And, while we want to go at it and, it's fair game to hit each other as hard as we can possibly hit each other and, try and knock each other out and all that other stuff while we're playing within the context of the game, this crossed the line. So to me, I think Myles Garrett absolutely deserves what he got. He didn't deserve 3 games. I thought, because if going with that same thing of the code of players, most players say, it's up to him to defend his quarterback. I thought Pouncey maybe 1 game would have been enough and a fine. The guy that hit Rudolph from behind, that got 1 game from Cleveland, his name escapes me. I thought 1 game was appropriate for him. I'm not sure I understand the $250,000 fine for the Steelers, but whatever. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. Ultimately, the NFL knows this was a really, really bad look for them, and that's why they acted so swiftly and quickly and severely.
What do you say to the people who say, hey, look, this is just an extension of the game. This is still on the confines of the game. You had a guy bleeding out of his ear after a helmet-to-helmet earlier in the same game. Look at what happened to Rudolph earlier. What do you say to those people? Aren't you being a little hypocritical and over the top in this suspension and this punishment? Because this is an extremely barbarous, violent game.
Well, I mean, I think that when you talk about some of those helmet-to-helmet hits and things of the such, that's still, even though, that some of them are dirty or whatever, that's still within the context of playing football. I mean, and there's sometimes some of those things are not quite intentional. There are absolutely times when guys have launched themselves and made themselves in a weapon, and you know what? They get fined for it and whatever. This goes outside the confines of playing football. When you grab a guy's helmet off his head and then try and decapitate him with it, that to me is outside of the confines of playing football. There's some other hits that happened in this game. The one, to Deontay Johnson, the one to Juju Smith-Schuster, a couple of these other ones that will get fined. Guys will have to pay, whatever it is. They should, but that's different in my mind than what Myles Garrett did. I mean, Really, to be honest, what Myles Garrett did is, one of the worst things I've seen on a field by a player. And you know what? All of the players and former players, they all seem to agree with me.
Yeah. Visiting with Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Fan 93.7 in Pittsburgh. What just is the general response from the people of Pittsburgh that you're hearing today? What's happening there?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of people that are really upset and feel like even, there's somewhat of a double standard. If it was Tom Brady, if it was somebody else that took it, this would be the biggest deal in the world. I don't agree with that. I think that's mostly a mythical whining, just among whiners. That's basically what they bring out is, oh, well, the rules are different for other guys. They're not. If Myles Garrett did the same thing to Tom Brady, the outrage would be the same. The suspension would be the same. And you know what? 6 games is appropriate. The end of the season, he obviously is going to lose a lot of money. And he hurts the Browns because he's, maybe their best defensive player. But here in this town, people are still up in arms about the fact that, he got away with it and that there's, the one or two, wackos out there that are out trying to blame Mason Rudolph or something for this. I mean, come on. So people here are just, and I'll tell you, people here are actually more upset that they lost to the Browns than anything that happened in the game.
So, but are those people referencing the video that where he saw Rudolph trying to pull Garrett's helmet off? Is that an extenuating circumstance in any way? Do you think is that something that should we be factoring into this at all?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because there's another angle that that I actually retweeted that there's another angle where Garrett clearly has the opportunity to get off of Rudolph, and he doesn't. He wants to try and drive him down into the ground even a little further. Rudolph is just kind of trying to defend himself and basically get Garrett off of him. I mean, here's the thing. I think Rudolph is going to get a little bit of a fine, and I don't think he should, but I think the NFL understands that they're going to have to really be vigilant with this whole thing. But I don't see that as any kind of reason or factor into why. I think Myles Garrett just blew a gasket because he tried to bully a quarterback and the quarterback wasn't going to back down.
Right. Visiting with Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 93.7 The Fan. Now let's talk a little bit about football. Let's talk about the Steelers, which I think is one of the more fascinating studies this year in the NFL. What's gone on, starting from the very beginning with Roethlisberger going down, now Mason Rudolph, what happened to Rudolph and with Thomas, and now the resurgence of the team, and now we have this. But more specifically with the Steelers, a lot of people jumped onto that Steeler bandwagon when the team went to 5-4. Now we're at 5-5. Which Steeler team is it? Is it the team that resurged in the win column, or is it a team that's going to settle into 500 or below going forward?
Well, here's the thing that you look at. They're 5-5, right? They had won 5 out of 6 games. They'd won 4 in a row. If I told you they were going to lose a Thursday night game on the road, I think most people would be not that shocked. You know, those games are terrible. And let's make no mistake, the Browns played pretty but they were not very good either. They just were better than the Steelers and were able to make a couple of more plays. But those Thursday night games are really bad. Here's what I see. I see a team that's got a really good in the Steelers. They've got a really good defense who's proven they can keep them in games and even score some points and win games and give short fields. They've got an offense that isn't very terribly scary, but can be effective. And they've got a field goal kicker who's been pretty reliable. So to me, you know, you have that formula where if Rudolph doesn't turn the ball over, which he hadn't turned the ball over until last night, really. I mean, if you look at it, I think he had like 11 touchdowns and 3 interceptions or something. I mean, last night was really, you know, a bad night for him. But if he doesn't turn the ball over, and they can stay somewhat healthy, which they have not been able to do. But if they can get Juju back and they get Deontay Johnson back and James Conner can, you know, come back and be healthy. I mean, here's the thing. They're 5-5. Let's say it takes, 9-7 maybe in the AFC to get to the playoffs, okay? So they're 5-5. They need 4 more wins, right? And they've got, 6 more games. You say, 4-2, that's going to be really hard for them to do. Yeah, but they play the Bengals. Then they play at home against the Browns. They've got games against the Cardinals and the Jets. And then they play at home against the Bills. That's 5 of their 6 games. You want to tell me they're going to lose that last game against the Ravens? Okay, fine. Down there, I'll say that. But those other 5 games, and it's not exactly like they're playing a who's who of, the great teams in the NFL. And here's the other thing I would say. That game against the Ravens might not have anything to play for in that game. So they might, have Lamar Jackson sitting down and, all the guys that they want to have ready for the playoffs. They might not even play that game to win because they might not need it and they want to keep everyone healthy. So to me, I look at it. I know what people are saying about the Steelers, but I don't know that they've got incredibly heavy lifting ahead of them.
You make a very compelling case for the playoffs, but this is the Steelers we're talking about. So don't tell me you're saying that Mason Rudolph is going to lead this team to the Super Bowl. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, hell no. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if you look at it, when Ben Roethlisberger went down, people were talking about how this team was going to go, 0-5 or 1-15, and things of the such. And I was kind of like a couple things. One, it's the Steelers. They have a pretty good pedigree of figuring it out and figuring out how to not go to 1-15 or even 4-12. I mean, they usually, when their bad years, are 7-9. So let's go there. Secondly, Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season, and so he's figured it out as well. And third, I thought their defense had a chance to be pretty good, and that was before they got Minka Fitzpatrick. So, I don't think this is a Super Bowl team. Don't get me wrong. But if they make the playoffs, I don't know how anybody, given all that has gone on with this team, given the fact that they've lost, Ben Roethlisberger for the season. And here's the other thing. Let's not forget, they are trying to replace maybe the best receiver in the history of football, or at the very least, the most productive over the last 6 years, the most productive receiver over a 6-year period in the history of football. They're trying to replace that. They didn't have him last year, but over the last 3 or 4 years, they've had one of the best running backs in the league. Yep. They're trying to replace that with a guy who, by the way, has got a great story, but he's injury prone. I mean, it's at some point you say, listen, James Conner's backstory is incredible. Played at Pitt, everything that he's beaten in his life and all the other stuff, but he can't stay healthy. They need to go find another running back. And so my point is, all that's happened, if this team makes the playoffs, Mike Tomlin should be in the running. I'm not saying he should win it, but in the running for Coach of the Year.
We're visiting with Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 93.7 The Fan. One more thing for you. What's the ceiling on Mason Rudolph? Is this your quarterback of the future? Just as a caveat, I don't think he is, but I want to hear your perspective. And what are people saying out there about him?
Well, they're very mixed. We still have what I call the Ben Roethlisberger fanboy club, who are just, they're so defensive about everything, that Mason Rudolph could throw for 600 yards and 10 touchdowns. And they'd say, well, Ben would have thrown for 650 and 11. But the bottom line is, when you really take a look at Mason Rudolph, I think the jury is still out from the standpoint of, I would like to see him have 4 or 5 weeks in a row with everybody healthy, with the guys that he's going to be going forward with, Juju. Juju Smith-Schuster has not had a good season at all. I mean, if the number one job of a receiver is to catch the ball, he's failed at that job more than he's, you know what I mean? But he's got to be your best receiver. We just talked about Connor. I'd like to see 4 or 5 weeks, because the bottom line is the jabronis they have behind them are just guys. They're just guys. They're not running backs. They're not starting running backs. Jalen Samuels is a nice little story, but he is what he is. They got, who I call the other Edmonds. Their first round pick is the safety from Virginia Tech, and then they've got his brother, who's like their fourth string running back. And then they got some guy from Oregon with a bunch of hyphens in his name. I don't even know what his name is. You know what I'm saying? This guy is like getting carries for them. I would just like to see 3 or 4 weeks in a row where Mason Rudolph has the same offense, the same skill position guys, and they play well. And the other part of it is that offensive line that they're paying a lot of money. I'd like to see them have one good game this year, which they have not. So to answer your question, it's a very incomplete answer, just because I don't know that we've seen Mason Rudolph have a real legitimate chance to be successful.
And you know what? I think you make a very good point. But just watching him, the guy looks stiff. I don't know if he can make the throws, but when he's under duress, when he doesn't have a running game, when he doesn't have playmakers amongst the wide receivers, and the guys, when they are playing, aren't making plays, you've got me rethinking a little bit on Mason Rudolph. I can't thank you enough for jumping on a crazy day, man. I really, really appreciate it, Paul. It's a lot of fun listening to you, man.
Yeah, anytime, that. And think about this before I let you go. I mean, last night, Mason Rudolph's top receiving, well, I guess he had James Washington. His second receiving threat was something named Mike Bolton. I mean, seriously, if you look, they had, I think, out of their eight skill position players that they had left after the first quarter when everyone got hurt, like 6 of them had been cut this year. So, I mean, the guy just needs an opportunity to be put in a position where he can succeed before I make a decision on whether he can play or not.
Don't disagree. Thanks, man. And hey, thanks for the sunroof, by the way. Great lighting. I love that.
Yeah, I had to help you out there so you can see me a little bit. All right, thanks, man.
That's Paul Zeiss of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 93.7 The Fan. And I think a point that he makes, and I think the best point probably of them all, is the offensive line. Look, you're always going to have injuries. You're always going to have problems. One of the genius things of Tom Brady's career is what he's describing. Tom Brady is, to a certain extent, had to deal with that every year of his career, right? Where they're mixing and matching and patchwork. And that's one of the genius things about Belichick, the ability to get guys into play multiple positions, be able to plug guys in, be able to judge talent when a guy should be playing, when he shouldn't be playing, and when he should be gone. I think that you can't underrate that with Bill Belichick, especially. So to a certain extent, you're never going to have that static, perfect situation that Paul is setting up. That said, the offensive line was brutal last night. They made the Cleveland Browns look like the Steel Curtain of old, the Steelers. So they've got to play better. And you really can't expect Mason Rudolph to make the throws when he's constantly under duress. You could make the argument that his response, I mean, look, Myles Garrett tried to pile drive him into the ground after he was already down last night. I understand Rudolph's response. Hey, man, get off of me. Whatever I'm going to have to do, especially when those guys are breathing down his neck, knocking him down, sacking him, hurrying him, rushing him, pressuring him the whole game. And I think that's the big issue with the Steelers. When you look at the schedule, I also think in the second half of the Steelers, that's huge for them. I don't think it's a very good team, but it's not a very good division outside of the Ravens. Right? And do we really, really think that the Ravens defense is going to be a world-beating defense down the stretch? Oh, they're so much better now. After they were terrible at the beginning of the year, suddenly, overnight. So, but the Steelers, to me, are amongst the most interesting teams in the league. We talked to Greg Bedard, by the way, about another one of those teams, the 49ers and Jimmy G, trying to figure that situation out. So, A lot going on here on Sports by Brooks on FanCred. I want to thank all of our guests today, including Chad Fenn, who really worked with us on getting on the show. We're going to have Chad Fenn of the Boston Globe on Monday, talk sports media, the aftermath of this whole situation with Myles Garrett. Great job by Greg Bedard of the Boston Sports Journal and Las Vegas Review Journal. Daniel Roberts of Yahoo and Yahoo Finance does a streaming show weekdays over at Yahoo. And that is a show that cuts through the clutter and the noise. You're going to want to follow Read Dan Wright on Twitter. Okay. So Daniel Roberts, great guest, friend of the show. Hopefully going to have him back again soon. And you just got a chance to enjoy Paul Zeiss. Great personality, by the way. The jabronis. He dropped a jabronis on us, right? Paul Zeiss joining us. And you can guarantee we'll be back next week. And we'll be here every single weekday, as we have been for months, on FanCred. And so that's going to do it from Los Angeles for now. This is a live show, I might add. I want to remind you, because I have seen people today putting their podcasts out, right? Or their shows out saying, hey, wait a minute. Ignore the fact that we're ignoring Myles Garrett. Ignore that as you watch our podcast today or our show today that was taped yesterday. And they do sports. That'll never happen here. Ever. Always live. And of course, on demand here on the FanCred app. Thank you for downloading the app. Keep it in your pocket. Jump into the communities over the weekend. Going to be a huge weekend in the NFL and college football. Auburn, Georgia. We'll be back on Monday for reaction, analysis, in-depth and otherwise. My monologuing as well. But great job by our producer, Cam Smith, as always. Want to thank all the folks at FanCred. And we'll be back again on Monday at noon Eastern time. And for everybody at FanCred in Los Angeles, this is Brooks Melchior saying so long. This has been Sports by Brooks on FanCred.